Hi everyone, welcome to our introduction to ecology today. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about you may or may not remember from middle school, or you may just have knowledge of from your life experiences. A lot of this stuff is just introductory, but we are going to start our ecology unit today. So we'll start with, well, what is ecology? When you think of the word ecology, what do you think of? What are you picturing in your mind? Trees outside, right? Eco, I see that word at the beginning or that prefix, right? So ecology is the study of essentially not just the environment, but also interactions within that environment. It's the study of how organisms interact with one another. It's also incorporating the ecosystems that they live in and all the factors that make up that ecosystem. And there's a focus here on energy transfer. So how energy is transferred from one organism to the next. So it's kind of all these things encompassed, and today we're going to go through and kind of individually highlight what each of these things are about. Interactions between organisms, some things about the environment, and how energy is transferred. So we'll start with the definition of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is the combination of the biotic, which means living, and abiotic factors all in an area. So you can have terrestrial ecosystems, which are on land, like this picture here. You can also have marine ecosystems, like this picture here. And you can see in these two pictures that there are both living and non-living things that make up the pictures. So let's look at this one, for example, here. Biotic factors. What do you see, right? Well, we see fish, right? We see coral, some aquatic plants. Those would be biotic factors of the ecosystem. How about abiotic or non-living? What do you see? Well, the big one that jumps out to me is the water, right? Probably the oxygen that's in the water, right? Carbon dioxide, things like that. Those are abiotic factors, non-living components that make up an ecosystem. So let's go through and talk about some of the organisms that live in ecosystems and how they're classified. So we'll start with producers. We've talked about producers this year. Producers are organisms that can make their own food, or they do photosynthesis. They're also called autotrophs, so that might be a new word for you. I think we talked about it when we did photosynthesis this year. Autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food, and they're not always plants. Sometimes it can be protists or bacteria that can do it. Protists, you might remember the protist lab from this year. You guys looked at an amoeba, a paramecium, and a euglena, and you colored them in. If you remember, the euglena was the protist that had that whip-like tail. Do you remember coloring the tail? And you may remember that you colored chloroplasts that were inside of that organism. So that's an example of just a unicellular little organism that's able to do photosynthesis and make its own food, one that is not just a plant. All these pictures here are of plants. Those are your main photosynthesizers, but they're not the only kinds of producers on the planet. So autotroph producer means the same thing. All these organisms, for the most part, are using photosynthesis. You guys remember, right? Light-dependent, light-independent reaction, capturing the photons of energy from the sun and transforming it into food, or in the case of plants, it's transforming it into glucose molecules. And then if you're not a producer, well, then you're a consumer. So any organism that is not doing photosynthesis and is not able to make its own food is considered to be a heterotroph. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food. They have to get their energy by eating other organisms. So even if you're an organism that eats only plants, you're still considered a consumer. So here's some top-level consumers here, right? Some scary-looking ones that you wouldn't want to run into. These are all heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. They have to rely on other organisms for consumption to get their energy. You're a heterotroph, right? I've had students in the past tell me that because they can make their own sandwich, then they are an autotroph, which is not true, right? All the components of that sandwich came from other places, whether it be, the grain to make your bread, the turkey that was killed to make your lunch meat, whatever the case may be, right? So you are a heterotroph. And then we group consumers by what type of food they eat. So if you're an herbivore, you eat producers, and you might actually be an herbivore. If you're a vegan, or if you have an all-vegetarian diet, depending on what you eat, if you eat all plant-based food, then you're an herbivore. So these are organisms that eat producers. So here's an example with a gazelle that's eating some grass. Carnivores are the next type. You might consider yourself a carnivore if you are a meat eater. That's another name for a carnivore. Here's a picture here with a lion eating a piece of a zebra. So this is definitely a carnivore because it is consuming other consumers, essentially. And omnivores, you might consider yourself this if you have a diet where you eat both plant and meat, right? A lot of humans are considered to be omnivores. We eat both, right? You eat vegetables, but you probably have meat for protein in your diet, again, unless you're vegan. And here's an example with a grizzly bear. Grizzly bears are pretty ferocious looking, but in this case, they actually are omnivores. They eat berries and they also eat salmon. So this is your eating the producer and also eating another consumer, the fish. And then another type of consumer that kind of gets overlooked but actually has a really important and rather gross job are decomposers. Decomposers are organisms that break down essentially dead stuff, dead tissue, dead waste. Examples of those organisms can be fungi like mushrooms. Earthworms are another example. Had we been in school together at this point, we would be getting ready to dissect an earthworm. Unfortunately, we're not getting to do that, but they are decomposers. They travel through the soil and they essentially just eat the soil, eat the dirt, eat any matter that's in it. So they are considered decomposers. And we're going to look at a very quick time-lapse video of a rabbit decomposing. Now, if you're squeamish, there's no blood or guts or anything like that. It's just showing you a time-lapse of how the rabbit's broken down over time. So let's view that together now. You can see by the third day here, we have a lot of activity, a lot of decomposers at work. Probably fungus in the soil. You've probably got some worms, small insects. You can see a lot of them there in the picture now. Breaking down a lot of the components of that rabbit, releasing any energy that was stored in that part of the rabbit back to the environment, back to the earth, back to the soil, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, all that stuff, hydrogen. You can see some larger beetle-like decomposers now coming in. Gross, a lot of maggots. So what's left at the end of about a week now is just a lot of fur, probably bones, things that the decomposers couldn't totally break down within the span of a week. Eventually it would all break down, but just in the span of a week, here you see a lot of what made it a rabbit is now gone. It's been returned back to the soil, back to the earth. Decomposers have a really important job. Not only do they clear all the dead stuff, which is gross, right? Can you imagine if anything that ever died that was left behind remained, right? We'd be walking over piles of dead things. That's gross, right? And then just any like leaves that fall, like where do they go if people don't rake them up, right? That's decomposers doing all that. So they're responsible for breaking down all the dead stuff and returning all that stored energy that's locked inside of the muscles and molecules of these organisms back to the earth. So those are decomposers. So we'll pick up next with our trophic levels. You may have heard this word before in middle school. Trophic levels are essentially where the organism falls along an energy pyramid. So this picture here is kind of a very simplified version of an energy pyramid. So an organism's trophic level is dictated by the position it falls in terms of how much energy it gets. So in the pyramid here, you can see that the most amount of energy is at the base of the pyramid with our plants, and the least amount of energy is at the top with our predators. So producers belong to what they call the first trophic level, and they have the most energy. They have the most energy because they have an unlimited amount of it, right, coming from the sun. As you work your way up the energy pyramid, herbivores are next. They're going to be your second trophic level consumers. And then usually you have omnivores, carnivores in your tertiary or third and fourth level consumers. So once you get to the top of the pyramid, there's not a lot of energy left. And the energy starts to decrease as you move along. And I'm going to talk about why that is and the rule of ecology and how that works in a minute here. But if you're just thinking about it from the standpoint of just watching that rabbit decompose, there were parts of that rabbit that were not totally broken down by the decomposers. There are parts of organisms that get used up throughout their lifetime that can't be transferred to the energy level above it. So a lot of times energy gets what we call lost. It's not lost like in the sense like, oh my God, I can't find it. It's lost in the sense that it can't be transferred to the level above it. So if you think about the organisms that are on our planet, there are a lot more plants than there are, say, lions, right? Or hawks, right? Some of your top level consumers or predators, because there's not as much energy to support those organisms that are at the top of the energy pyramid, whereas there's unlimited energy to support the organisms down here, which is why there's so many more of them. All right, so let's talk about food chains. So you've probably seen a food chain before. A food chain is a single pathway of a feeding relationship within an ecosystem. It usually involves anywhere from 4 to 5 organisms, and it usually contains arrows. You might have seen this in middle school. One of the biggest misconceptions I see with students when they get to honors bio is that they often think that the arrows show the direction of who eats who. Maybe that's something you do in middle school, but in a true food chain, the arrows should be showing the direction in which the energy is being transferred. So here is our producer. We have some grass here getting its energy from the sun. If a mouse were to come along and eat that grass, so that's our primary consumer, the energy that's contained within this grass will be transferred to the mouse. And then if that mouse was eaten by a snake, our secondary consumer, that energy from the mouse's body would be transferred to the snake. And if that snake was eaten by a hawk, the hawk would be our tertiary consumer. It's going to get the energy transferred from the snake's body to its body. So this is a food chain. They're really easy, right? The only important thing to remember is that you don't get tripped up and you draw the arrows the right way or show the correct energy flow. And then you can incorporate all of those food chains into a food web. So food webs are just an interconnected just combination of food chains. So you can see this ecosystem here has a bunch of different organisms in it, and you can see the arrows showing the direction in which the energy gets transferred. So all the arrows are going away from the grass because the grass is our producer, and all the arrows end up pointing to the top consumer here, which is the hawk. Ultimately, all energy would be transferred to this organism here because it's able to eat all of the other organisms, whereas the rabbit is only ever getting its energy from the grass, so on and so forth. All right. So that energy pyramid that I showed you a minute ago that had the top producers or the consumers at the top with not a lot of energy relates to this rule in ecology, the energy transfer rule. And the energy transfer rule states that roughly 10% of total energy is transferred to the next trophic level, and 90% of energy is lost at each level. So what does that mean, really? If you look at this energy pyramid here, you have a million J of sunlight. J stands for joules. You may know from chemistry or physics that joules are a unit of energy. And then if you move to the next level, the producers, they get 10,000 of that a million. And then the next level has 1,000 of the 10,000. 100 of the 1,000, and 10 of the 100. So from trophic level to trophic level, you lose 90% of the energy, and only 10 is able to be transferred to the level above it. And the reason for that is because there are things that organisms do that expend energy, and that energy then would not be transferred to the organism that eats them. So let's take, for example, this mouse, right? Mouse is running around, eating grass, burrowing holes, doing mouse things, of course. And all of that is going to expend energy. It's energy it's ATP, right, that mouse is expending or using. And if it uses it up and it gets transferred to the environment, say as heat, right, as it's running around, its body is giving off heat, that energy then can't be captured by the organism that eats it. So 90% of that energy that this mouse had was transferred to its environment or used up by the mouse, and then not transferred to the snake. The snake is able to get 10% of the energy from the mouse when it eats it. So as you move up the trophic levels, you lose energy till you get to the top, which goes back to what I was saying a couple minutes ago. That's why you don't have as many of these top consumers on the earth as you do some of the primary consumers, and especially the producers. They have more access to energy than these organisms at the top. By this rule of ecology, you can't support a planet that is covered in snakes. There won't be enough energy to keep them all alive. So now we're going to look at some interactions between organisms. Remember, that's one of our components of the definition of ecology. Sorry, I have my windows open and the planes are flying right over my house today. I don't know if you can hear them, so I apologize. Symbiosis is formally the definition of it, is a relationship between two species that live together. And there can be different kinds of symbiotic relationships. There can be ones where both organisms they benefit from the relationship. There can be examples where one benefits and the other one is unharmed or unaffected. And mutualism, where they're both benefit benefited. So you might remember these from middle school. We're going to go through and look at some examples. We're also going to look at some video examples of different types of symbiotic relationships as well. We'll start with commensalism. In a commensalistic relationship, one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. So in this example here, you have orchids on a tree. An orchid is a flower. This grows on top of the branches of these trees, which helps it get closer to the sun, helps it for having the mechanical support to not fall and get closer to the sun, where it's something it could not do on its own on the ground. And the tree is unaffected by the growth of the orchids, but the orchids benefit because they're getting closer range to the sun for more photosynthesis. We're going to look at another classic example here of commensalism. You might be familiar with this one. So you may have seen this before. This is a whale shark, or just a shark in general. They get followed by these little fish called remora fish. The remora fish swim along and they actually suction cup themselves to the sharks, and they eat basically scraps of food that the shark releases as it's eating its own meal. The shark isn't bothered by these fish. It's not affected by them. It's not harmed. It's not helped. It's just kind of there, not benefiting from the relationship, but also not being hurt by the relationship. And the remora fish are benefited because they get basically scraps. They get a free meal. So this is a classic example of commensalism. Imagine if this animal was to eat something in the ocean, right? It's not going to do a nice clean job of eating that meal. It's going to have parts of the organism, if it's like a fish, a large fish or something, floating about all around its mouth, and the remora fish would pick up those scraps. All right, and then we're moving on to parasitism. Parasitism is, as the name suggests, it is a relationship with a parasite. If you think of somebody, who's a parasite to you, they're always wanting things, right? But they never offer anything in return, right? So a parasitic relationship is where one organism is helped and the other is harmed. So if you have any pets, right? Fleas and ticks, they are parasites. They are being helped by getting blood and nutrients from your pet. Your pet is being harmed because they're uncomfortable, right? They're being bitten, they're having their blood sucked, right, from these organisms. You too, right? If you have a tick on you, it is that time of year now where you can easily go out for a walk and come home with a tick depending on where you live. Same idea here. We're going to look at a rather interesting example of a parasitic relationship. If you're a little squeamish, this one might be a little bit of a doozy for you, but it's really interesting. So this is a parasitic relationship.
Our parasitized caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat. The glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight. The larvae have not yet finished growing and need to keep their host alive. So although they feast on the caterpillar's blood, they have been careful not to touch a single one of its vital organs. This uneasy truce will not last. Within days, the larvae are fully matured. Suddenly, they begin to stir into action. For the past 2 weeks, this surrogate womb has protected them, but now they no longer need it. To complete the next stage of their life cycle, they must break out. The caterpillar's thick skin should be a solid barrier to the parasitic wasp larvae. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny, saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out. Stroke by stroke, the larvae slice through the tough layers of skin. At the same time, they release chemicals that paralyze the caterpillar. As the larvae break through, there is nothing it can do. Free at last, the larvae enter a new phase of development. They swiftly spin silken cocoons. These will provide the perfect environment for their final transformation. But ironically, one of the greatest dangers the larvae will face is being themselves impregnated by other species of parasitic wasp. Incredibly, the wounded caterpillar helps them out. Usually, a caterpillar would spin a silken blanket to make its own cocoon. But the parasitized caterpillar spins his blanket on top of the wasp cocoons, giving them an extra layer of protection. Scientists believe the same wasp virus that infected it weeks before has now invaded the caterpillar's brain and caused this bizarre corruption of its normal behavior. Amazingly, the caterpillar's natural aggression is now also exploited by the wasp virus.
Gross, right? But there is an ultimate in parasitic relationship. This wasp laid its eggs inside of the caterpillar. They grew in there, and then they literally came busting out of the caterpillar. And then the caterpillar is so infected by these wasps that it then protects the larvae of the wasp to help them make sure that they survive. And the caterpillar is getting nothing out of that relationship, right? So definitely being harmed. All right. And then finally, here's another example with, parasitism. This is a lamprey. If you've ever seen one of these, they come up alongside a fish and they cut part of them out and they eat them, digest them. Mutualism, the last one here. This is when you have both species that benefit from the relationship. One example here are with these birds that come along and they help to clean the back of the rhino. There's examples with plover birds, which fly into a crocodile's mouth and clean their teeth, and then the crocodile, of course, has its teeth cleaned, and the plover bird gets some essentially food from eating the food that's in the crocodile's teeth. So that's a mutualistic relationship. And then I'm going to show you one here that you might be familiar with from a Disney classic.
There is another way to take advantage of poison without eating it. The anemones have such an efficient defense system that no one has ever found a vaccine to counteract its toxins and to live calmly among its tentacles. When a clownfish chooses an anemone, he can't enter it just like that. He would die due to the tens of thousands of micro stings received, and later he would be devoured. This process of immune adaptation is very delicate and somewhat painful. The question is allowing itself to be stung little by little in order to discover the exact composition of the mucus that covers every tentacle of the anemone. This mucus is what prevents the arms from shooting its harpoons between them when they come into contact. The clownfish copy the molecular structure of this protective shield and then reproduce it over their scales. Chemically disguised, they're not identified as a foreign body, and the invertebrate doesn't attack them. However, the fish takes care of its home, and with great care, which is why they can't be considered an ungrateful guest. The clownfish's protection against predators is impregnable. It's better than an electric fence. Even the best hunters can't beat him.
All right, so another example of mutualism where both organisms in that case are benefiting. The clownfish, because it essentially has a home that no other organism is able to attack them in, and then it maintains that anemone or keeps it clean, keeps it free of pests. So both organisms are benefiting from that relationship. And then finally, with getting along, you also have competition. There is competition in ecosystems among organisms. This competition can be broken down into two kind of categories. It can be interspecific, where you have competition between organisms of two different species in the ecosystem. So if you had like a grassland ecosystem, here's hyena and female tiger competing with one another, of course, for probably territory, water, something like that. And then on the flip side of that, you have intra-specific competition. Intra-specific competition is between members of the same species. So this is usually when males are competing against one another for a female. Here's an example with two flamingos. You may have seen, driving along, or we live in an area where there are a lot of deer. You may have seen, two male deer with their antlers locked. If you see something like that, it's usually over territory or over a female. So that's intra-specific competition. All right, so that's our introduction to ecology for the week. Dive into more of this stuff as the week progresses. Have a good day, everybody.